Uh, Great. So our first speaker today is going to be Victor Lutsishin. Victor's a junior undergraduate student at the College of the Holy Cross. He's a political science major, and he's also a native of Kherson, Ukraine. Victor joined us as a guest on this program in the fall, immediately in the wake of the Ukrainian liberation of his native city. And he was such a memorably thoughtful guest that we knew we'd be having him back. And I'm really happy we're here with us today. Then we'll have John Wsieteczka. John, I don't know if I got your last name right. I forgot to ask the right pronunciation. John's a PhD candidate in history at Michigan State University, where he's writing a dissertation focused on the immediate and longer-term implications of the 1932-33 famine in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor. Exploring how it continued to impact, influence, and shape lives and life trajectories long after the starvation had officially come to an end. John was in Ukraine doing research on a Fulbright fellowship when he was forced to evacuate due to Russia's war. And finally, we're going to be joined by Professor Mayhill Fowler of Stetson University. Mayhill's a former actress who spent a tremendous amount of time in Ukraine, with wide connections in academic and cultural spheres there. She's previously taught at the Ukrainian Catholic University and at various summer workshops across Ukraine. She's the author of a book, Beau Monde on Empire's Edge, State and Stage in Soviet Ukraine, and she's broadly a specialist on Ukrainian cultural history and the history of Ukrainian theater. We've asked each of the guests to open us up with just a few minutes of sort of food for thought based on their experiences of the last year. And then we'll open it up to audience questions and discussions. And Victor, with that, we'll start with you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for having me. Well, I guess I just wanted to start off with talking a little bit about, what this anniversary really means for Ukraine and the people of Ukraine, and then just share some personal experiences. And I think when we talk about this anniversary, I think it's important to recognize that it signifies a certain transition in in Ukraine and in the mindset of the people, and it's not necessarily a very positive one. And what I mean by that is that from my personal observations and talking to my family, friends back home, I feel like that during this year, what has kept people going is the hope and notion that this war was gonna be quick, maybe not quick, but people hope that just a few more months and everything will end, just a little more and there will be a huge counteroffensive and everything will go back to normal. And now that the whole year has passed, I feel like more and more people kind of have to come to terms with the realization that what we thought was going to be just a few difficult months are likely to become a new normal, a new state of life. And this notion is reinforced by recent Putin speech. If anyone has seen it a couple of days ago, where the underlying notion is also that people have to be prepared that this is a long-term thing, that this is going to last for a very long time, and this is just how things are right now. And I definitely feel like this kind of disappointment among the people now that we move into the second year. And it's also reflected in how people perceive Russia as well, because for the longest time there have been talks about, that Russia is going to collapse soon, or there are going to be a regime change, things like that. But now it becomes more and more clear that Russia is going to, the way it has been, it's going to carry on, and it's going to be a constant existential threat to existence of Ukraine. And even if war was to end any day now, it wouldn't change the fact that Russia is still there. It's an aggressor, and it will be there for a long time. And that's just something that people have to live with and accept. And I think this is quite sad. And I think I personally, and a lot of people who are close to me, came to this realization even earlier through our experiences with Kherson. That's the city where I come from. And, a few months ago we were celebrating its liberation after 7 months of occupation, and it was nearly a national holiday. And when it just happened, if you go into Kherson Telegram and different chats, people were asking, when can I come back? Should I just wait a couple weeks and go back home? Like, is everything over? So people were very hopeful, thinking that this was the end of it. But as the time went on, it turned out that things aren't as people expected. As since the Kherson was liberated, Russian troops moved on the other side of the river, which is right next to the city, and it has been shelled constantly ever since then. And if you go on the news, you see every day there is a, a few people killed there and here in Kherson by shellings and bombs, and or people lost electricity or heating, and the city has virtually became a ghost town now. When you look at some videos of people going there right now, you just see a couple people here and there on streets that used to be populated, and it generally just very old people who probably have um, just have nowhere else to go. And I talk to a lot of my friends and family, and this is the point where people stop talking about going back to Kherson, and this is a very sad experience for people around me and myself, because it's not an easy thing to come to terms with the fact that your home is maybe not gone, but you're not going back there anytime soon. And I myself, you know for the longest part, was hoping that I will soon be able to come back home, but recently I just accepted the idea that it might be years and years before I go back to the place that I call my home. And yeah, and I mean, I don't mean to be very negative, but I think that's something very important to understand about the state of collective psyche in Ukraine. And I think that's why it's so important to continue to actively push for Western support, because Ukraine's survival is going to depend on the uh, enthusiasm of Western allies to help it and provide ammunition and everything else. Because what we hoped could be a 1 year of war might as well turn out to be 2, 3, or even 5 years at this point. And I think when we talk about this moving forward, there's just something that we have to uh, keep in mind, both in terms of what it means for future Ukraine, but also what it means for the people Ukraine and their personal experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, good afternoon to everyone tuning in, and thank you to Cynthia and Stephen and the others for inviting me to this this talk today and this conversation, which is on a critically important day and a really solemn day for a lot of us. And I'm not really sure what else to say on that issue, except for it's hard to believe that it's been a year since the last February 24th. Trauma does complex things to our notions of time. And that's actually what I just want to speak about for a couple of minutes here as we sort of think through what we are living through and what we have lived through. And I want to talk about time in sort of relation to my sort of coming to as a historian, as a professional historian, as a certain generation of historian that's perhaps a little bit on the younger end of things right now. And I want to sort of go back to when I first see this moment happening for me. And it was in 2012 when I entered my master's program. Unlike so many others that are 5, 10 years older than me, I didn't come into this field interested in Russian history. I didn't come in wanting to study Russia per se. In fact, due to my Czech background, I had a strong interest in, Havelian politics. I wanted to be a Czech intellectual historian. And I studied this at the University of Northern Colorado with Steven Siegel, whom many of you know. But it was through his teaching, actually, that I came into Ukraine on accident. And I heard one lecture on the 1932-33 Holodomor, and the rest is history. I got sort of involved in studying Ukraine, and I never looked back. But as a student in a standalone MA program at the time, the real writing and finishing of that master's thesis happened between 2013 and 2014, which were critical years in Ukraine. So as I write about the dark past of the 1930s under the context of Euromaidan in 2013 and 2014, I understood Ukraine in a way that perhaps maybe others weren't looking at it. It's not to say that I only understood it in a way that only I could, but it was a moment of thinking about just recently, I sort of did the math, and to think about Ukraine being occupied by Russian forces for 1/3 of my life, if you think of it in those terms, I've sort of grown up professionally as a historian in 2013, 2014, only traveling to Ukraine with Russian forces present in its territories. And I think that's something to think about in my generation of historians who work, sort of specifically in Ukraine. And so after grad school, I took a pause outside of the academy, and I taught in the local school district in Greeley, Colorado. And in 2015, the war remained close. And this is sort of a reminder that February 24th, 2022 is a really dark moment in a much longer timeline of this war. It's been going on for 9 years. It's something that I'm starting to see represented more in the media, and that's great. As a historian, of course, there are debates that this has been going on for decades or centuries or even longer. We can have these conversations, but in sort of the contemporary sphere, I go back to 2015, and the war became somehow even closer to me then. I was teaching, and a young sort of girl arrived to my school from Luhansk, and she had been displaced. Her and her mother arrived in Colorado. And it was due to what was going on in the East. Her father stayed behind, and her parents were not separated, but her mother told me that they never had plans to go back. And they formed a new life in Colorado, and the student did very well. I became kind of close with her, helping her adapt into an American school system. She was able to speak Russian in the halls, and say hi. And it was sort of a coding thing for her, where we could have some kind of, relationship that made her feel welcome in a way that she knew I understood, because I knew her country and she knew that. I'm not sure what happened to the student. I'm not sure if she's still in the US or if they went back home. I think they stayed. But the point is, the war became closer to me even then in 2015, right? After the events that took place in February of 2014. And this student came to me and made me sort of rethink about Ukraine and its sort of transnational and international dimensions. So we skip forward a couple more years. I stepped back into the academy to go back and get my PhD, and I start traveling to Ukraine regularly again. And I won't forget, it must have been maybe in, 2017, 2018. And I was walking around in Lviv. I was studying at Ukrainian Catholic University, where I've been a student numerous times to study language and culture. And as many of you know, it's a beautiful city, just like many cities in Ukraine, for walking. And I was walking, at Lychakiv Cemetery. It's a hauntingly beautiful place to go and ruminate, to think. I would go there after working in the archives. It's a great spot. It's one of my favorites, and I go there a lot. And I accidentally came across a funeral that day for a soldier who had died at the front. And I remember I wrote specifically, I looked back this morning in my journal that on that day, the war felt really close. And I remember thinking sort of back to the stories I've told you now, back to 2015 and then back to 2013, 14, and starting to piece together this narrative of what was happening. And I went back to that same place in the cemetery a couple of weeks later, and the soil was still fresh, still protruding from the ground. And there had been more burials since. And if you've been in that cemetery, it sort of sits on the backside. There's a special area there just for soldiers who have died fighting. It's surrounded by big crosses that are representative of the victims of the 1946-47 famine. The remains are buried there underneath. So it's quite a place to go. Okay, skip to 2021. Before, my Fulbright was delayed due to the pandemic. So it was pushed back quite a ways, and I didn't end up getting to Kyiv until the fall of 2021. And before that, in the spring and summer of 2021, there had already been sort of an amassment of troops on the borders. It was already happening. It was being talked about a little bit, but neglected in many other ways. And I arrived in what they called the red zone in Ukraine during the pandemic. Things were supposed to be shut down, but as Ukraine does, it carries on in its own way. And so, I was still able to do work, but the war started to feel closer still. I mean, at the time, nobody really thought there, at least, that anything would happen. I mean, come to find out much later on, the US government knew a hell of a lot, and they knew a hell of a lot for a long time. And, it sort of that experience, and we can talk about this, the sort of the signals that spoke out to me about what might happen. I think that's something that we can talk about later. But February 24th happens. Before that, my Fulbright group had been sort of evacuated out of Ukraine and to Warsaw. And the whole plan was to wait 30 days. Every 30 days we would sort of check in and see if we would go back, but we knew that wasn't going to happen at that point. And so all this to say I just want us to sort of think about the timeline that we think of in this war. It's not a year as much as we really want to think it's been a year, and it's been a hellish year. There's no doubt about that. It's been a marker, February 24th, in a much longer timeline of this war. But I sort of challenge us today to resist that thinking of a year and to think about the longer occupation that has existed, especially for Ukrainians who have endured, because this is what it's about. It's about Ukraine. We have the privilege to sit here in a safe space and talk about this, and that's something we have to recognize. But I hope that we can do service to Ukraine and to Ukrainians by sort of, using this time and space to think through maybe our preconceived notions of what this war is or was, or what we thought it was, or the timeline that we think it exists in. I know for me, having gone through this, it's been traumatic in many ways, but much less for me than for others who are in Ukraine, of course. But it does play with our sort of ability to understand and interpret this war. And I think this is something that we can open up for discussion is why did it take February 24th, 2022 for the support to come in the way that it did? I mean, obviously things happened that hadn't happened before, but what happened before? And I keep looking back to time, to history, to sort of piece together the present. And, I'll finish with this. Historians are terrible predictors of the future. So our job, is really not going to be, I think, to think about what will happen. We can speculate. I remember being criticized by journalists, others, when I left Ukraine, telling me that because I left, I was contributing to a fear, the fear mongering of war. And I'm not the only one who faced that. Lots of other people got criticized for this, and of course I didn't choose to leave, I had to leave. But there were lots of people that never thought this was possible. And as we move forward, as we hear some of these statements about what might happen in Moldova or even in Taiwan, and people are calling this irrational to think this way, I just want to remind us, we don't want to stoke fear in any way, but I think that we need to be a little more graceful in our thinking towards people and the countries that could potentially face the wrath that Russia has laid out on Ukraine. And Ukraine is dealing with this for Europe and the world right now. And so as we move forward today, I hope we can talk about that more. Thank you.
John, thanks so much. That was really powerful. Mayhill.
So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Steve and Cynthia for the invitation. So yes, I'm a historian of Ukraine. I've been studying Ukraine since 2005. I first went in 2006, and I've been going every year except last year, 2022. I've traveled all over thanks to summer schools I'm happy to talk about. I've been able to teach in Kherson, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv 3 times, Chernivtsi, Lviv 4 or 5 times. It's my second home. And it's the place where my career is really developed. My sort of intellectual milieu in many ways is in Ukraine. I'm affiliated with the Center for Urban History in Lviv. I think they spoke to this group last fall. And I'm affiliated with the Theater Studies program at Ivan Franko University in Lviv. I started teaching MA students online last spring, 2022, which was a rich experience. And I'm teaching online now. And I also started my job at Stetson in 2013, actually my full-time teaching job. And I was teaching European history like when Maidan started. And so I realized my entire teaching career has been with war in Ukraine. So I want to make 3 points that I hope will be interesting. And I'll start with teaching. I was teaching 4 courses last spring and all on the region. And they all changed after February 24th. So I'll just start with one, which is Soviet history. I'm sure a lot of people on the Zoom teach Soviet history, and I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling that teaching and writing Soviet history now is an epistemological challenge. It's a challenge of how we come to know this entity, how we explain things, and the categories that we use, because of the continuity that I don't think can be avoided between the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation in terms of state violence, violence embedded in institutions, and lack of regard for the individual. I work at a small, non-elite college in Florida, and it means there's a certain demography and a certain political demography in which I teach. And so Soviet history for us, it's a gen ed class. It might be the only time students take a history class, probably the only time they're going to come in contact with learning anything about the region. So it matters what they take away. And so my goal has always been not details, but like critical thinking in general. Most students arrive with certain preconceived notions that socialism somehow equals Stalin equals bad equals evil, right? And too much state is a bad thing. And so my goal is always just to get them to think critically about possible relationships between the citizen and the state. The USSR's mass violence for sure, but it's also mass participation in creating a social justice experiment that had free healthcare and free education. It may not have worked, but let's take it seriously. And I think this really comes from my own graduate training. I think I'm part of a specific generation of historians, trained by a specific generation of historians who treated the USSR as a civilization we had to take seriously without prejudice, right? This is after the Cold War. And we did it, and I stand by that, but I do think that in doing that, somehow we downplayed some of the violence in exploring alternative paths to modernity. Or rather, it seemed to me in spring 2022 that the only story of the USSR was one of violence. And I'll give you a quick example. So we always used to do a short paper in this course, a midterm paper, where students looked at memoirs of Soviet veterans of World War II. And it's great because for them, World War II is just D-Day and the Greatest Generation. And so they're exposed to the Eastern Front, right? But when they were working on this paper, news came out about Bucha. And Bucha had been under Russian occupation. And so we learned what Russian occupation meant. It meant torture, it meant rape, it meant violence, right? And the parallels and the resonances with World War II were terrifying, right? The Soviet army, in case anyone needs to be reminded, raped as it liberated Eastern Europe from Nazi occupation. And so this continuity was really impossible to ignore. But I felt like if I focused so much more on the crimes of the Soviet army, would I reify the American centeredness of these students? And I'll note the full-scale invasion changed my research as well. I've been working for years on a project about a theater managed by the Soviet army. And I felt, how on earth can I write about the Soviet army as patrons of the arts and not just as perpetrators of violence? I can speak more about that. The second thing I'd like to put out there is the ways that both our academic field and our public discourse is still Russia-focused, by which I mean erases Ukraine. In many ways, Ukraine still does not exist for many people. It's a sad image on the news, it's a donation link, but it does not exist as an independent state with agency in the same way that Germany or Russia or the US exists. And I know Ukraine's on the front page of the New York Times today. CNN did a special yesterday. There's been so much great work in our field on decolonization, great articles and conversations, amazing openness to rethink a career of scholarship and teaching. I don't think I could do it. I'm sure everyone on the Zoom is on the same page as I am, but I've been struck in the last year by conversations with very intelligent colleagues who just don't get it. They don't get that Ukraine is a place. It's more than just an appendage of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. It is an arena that connects places, that highlights questions, that is a driver of global politics and movements. I work on theater, and I still encounter this idea of like great Russian theater, which totally ignores theater in other places, like this guy, Les Kurbas, who is super big. And he had nothing to do with Stanislavski or Meyerhold or Russian theater. He was different, and he came from different influences and shaped theater development in Ukraine in different ways, and no one knows about him except Ukrainians and Ukrainianists. Why? Why is that still the case? And I actually wrote a piece on origins, current events, and historical perspective on avant-garde theater in Ukraine, and I will put it in the chat if you're interested. So the epistemic violence erasing Ukraine goes deep. Russian culture is part of an imperial project, and it's never innocent. And I wish we could stop separating arts and politics. I'll share originally when I was working on my dissertation, I had this idea, and I got some sexy fellowships because of it, that creativity can happen in dictatorship. Like there's a lot of dance in Putin's Russia today. But I think now, and I've been thinking for the last several years about the costs. What is the cost of that creativity? Not only to the artist, because actually creativity does pretty well in non-dictatorships too, But what about the cost to other people, other parts of the empire? Dancing in Moscow is destroying Ukraine today. In Moscow, artists support the state with their art, a state that is killing artists, and not only in Ukraine. And those artists who keep making art in Ukraine, and there are many of them, or Ukrainian artists making art outside Ukraine, they are resisting, they are fighting in this incredibly powerful way. Art is a field of war. And I think there's a connection between people denying any connection between art and politics, and people not seeing Ukraine geopolitically, believing that Ukraine should still compromise with Russia, not learning about this place, and yet making assumptions about it. And I think there's something very specific to Ukraine about this. I know Serhiy Plokhy is presented to this group. So it's not just the Russia-centeredness of our field, but like there's something about Ukraine historically, these long entanglements with empire, how for centuries the Russian Empire has been denying existence to this place, right? Whether Cossacks or Poles or Jews or Greek Catholics, denying the separateness of this place. And so we have to work to keep people seeing Ukraine. So as you can tell by the emotion in my voice, what the last year has done to me is that it's radicalized me. It probably radicalized me from the beginning of the war, right, in 2014, 2015, but it really happened last year. To write Ukraine is a political act. To speak Ukraine is a political act. We were asked to speak personally on this panel, but although I've been studying Ukraine for almost 20 years and I consider it my second country, I don't feel I have the right. My responsibility is to witness my friends and colleagues dealing with loss, death, destruction, whether at home or abroad. And my story is just a footnote. And I think a lot about a poem by Irina Shuvalova, whom everyone should know, where she talks about this question of like, do I have the right to hurt if I have no wounds? And I'll end with this. I've been thinking this week about the ways that war utterly changes life trajectories in ways that are like really painful to comprehend. You're just suddenly on a different path, a different part of the river, and there's no going back, and it's complicated. My school, Stetson, was one of the many taking Ukrainian scholars. We have a wonderful scholar teaching media literacy, but one of the few giving full support to undergrads. We have 4 studying with us this year, and they are extraordinary. So my year has been getting to know them, worrying about them for absolutely no reason. They're totally fine, but I worry. And so war has meant big things, but it's also meant the strange gift of talking with these 4 young people on some random Tuesday afternoon. It's not that war brings good and bad. It's just that you're in a totally different life and the old one is gone. And it's that enormity of war and that enormity of loss that I still can't wrap my head around. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayhel, for that very powerful statement. I have to say, when you said dancing in Moscow is destroying Ukraine today, I was thinking about that, and there's, I'm sure, so much to say about it, but I was thinking of how important it is to think about these strategies of pacification. And so for our audience, we'll be meeting next week to talk about we and Brave New World, and something that I think that it will hopefully we'll be able to get back to next week as well is the question of these strategies of creating consent, consent that and masking violence, which also was your point, Mayhel, how we mask it a bit in the way we teach our history, and how it is certainly being masked in propaganda efforts today. So traditionally, Steve and I start with a question. I was going to waive my question because there are so many guests who know more than me, and we want to include a variety of voices. But just again, to tie into something Mayhel said at the very end of her presentation, I'd just like to turn to Victor very quickly and ask him to just sort of briefly share his thoughts on how just in the last year alone, like how you and your contemporaries have changed your ideas about what Ukrainian identity means and what Russian identity means, or the relationship between the two.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, like you probably remember I talked last time. I think it's something to be talked about because at least for my generation, I'm only 23 years old, and when I was younger, I grew up in this world where because I come from Kherson, which is eastern Ukraine, I grew up with the notion that Russia and Ukraine, even though they were different countries and different histories, but we were like kind of always united. We were like brothers in some way. And again, obviously, there's a lot to talk about our very difficult history. But the fact of the matter is that there was this brief period of time where it seemed like for a moment, like we were together, like there wasn't any animosity between us. But obviously, everything changed very drastically after 2014, and especially after the outbreak of the war. And uh, yeah, I think when I think about it, I don't know mm, entirely myself if I'm happy or sad about it because there have been times when I felt sad. For example, Russian being my native language, that's the language I speak at home. That's the language I grew up with, and I never obviously identified myself as having anything to do with Russia, but it is a fact that is my language. And throughout this year, me and my friends, we have had to kind of reevaluate certain things, why we speak this language, like is it right to continue speaking it? And it's been a very strange experience, I have to say, like feel like the world around you changes and how so many people around me just who always spoke in Russian just refuse to do so and now only speak Ukrainian, and how you see um, people distancing themselves in any way possible from Russian culture, and and I think in terms of language, for me, it has been a little sad in some ways. But recently, I have had a more positive outlook on that, and I feel like what's kind of good about it is that now, I mean, this war has been nothing but terrible. But if there is a silver lining, I feel like it's that Ukraine has never been so united ideologically as it is right now, and it's this common like um, idea that we're moving towards the West, like more Western values, right? And I think it manifested itself in a lot of ways. And just to give you an interesting example, what I noticed people talking about in Ukraine right now is actually how perception of LGBT groups changed in Ukraine in the past few years. And like while there's still a lot of work to be done, the perception of LGBT groups has improved dramatically. And since the war started, there has been a lot of talking about how uh, LGBTQ community participates in the war, but and so they fight for their country, but they don't have the same rights as normal citizens do. And it has been very heartwarming to see this kind of change, these conversations that have never happened before. And I feel like in some ways there's a lot in like going into it, but I think to a big extent what contributed to it is this understanding that like we want to be separate from Russia, right? We want to distance ourselves from this ideology. We want to be different, and I think it has produced a lot of positive change. And and just speaking from my personal experience, for example, I grew up using Vkontakte a lot, VK. Maybe some of you probably familiar. It's the biggest Russian social media. And when I was younger, everybody in Ukraine was using it as well. And now looking back on it, I can I'm horrified and like just thinking what kind of negative impact it produced on a lot of Ukrainian population, especially on the young people, because when you go there, it's just a rabbit hole for ridiculization, right? There's a lot of like far right Russian propaganda going on all the time. And I myself have met a lot of Ukrainian people who have been influenced by it. And, ever since the war, like, and this rejection of everything Russian, while there are definitely some parts of it that maybe not necessarily very good, in some instances, like for example, I don't think, people who speak Russian should be ashamed for it, but at the same time, the good impact that it has produced is that this rejection of these far right ideologies, and like people start questioning like if they really make sense, right? And they reflect on their Ukrainian history and their relationship with Russia, and they realize that it doesn't make any sense, and obviously I don't have any like very strong data on that, but that's at least what has been my experience from talking to people around me. And especially me being in Eastern Ukraine, I met a lot of people who obviously been influenced by, Russian media, Russian ideology. So it's been really heartwarming to see this transformation and, shift towards, like embracing our own culture and unique identity. I hope that answers your question.
Terrific.
So I do want to invite everybody to raise your hand to ask questions in the chat. We really do want to have a conversation with these phenomenal guests. Let me start with a question that comes out of the chat from Steve Eisenberg for Mayhill. He says, Dr. Fowler, would you please comment on the removal of art from Ukraine by soldiers as they've overtaken geographic areas and the objective and the significance of this?
Yes, thank you for that question. I mean, really, the answer is yes. One of the things that people who study culture have been tracking since the beginning is the destruction of culture. The Maria Primachenko collection, right, at Ivankiev got a lot of press. Luckily, those museum workers had actually taken out the bulk of the collection. They'd saved it, but that was a big moment. The destruction of the Skovroda Museum outside Kharkiv, right? So there've been a lot of sort of cultural destruction, and then this removal of objects. There's a lot of reporting on Kherson, right, and objects that were taken from Kherson, and the destruction of culture is a part of genocide. And I think we can sort of tie this together with the destruction of Ukrainian textbooks, the banning of speaking the Ukrainian language under Russian occupation, and the forcible removal of Ukrainian culture. I think it's all of a piece, and it's really important to pay attention to, right? It's not only the destruction of life, right? But it is also the destruction of culture and the denying of any separateness to Ukrainian culture, right? That is one of the things that this war is about. So it's very, very important to follow.
Thanks. Let's go to Michael Moore. You should be able to unmute now, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you.
Yes.
All right. I am an old Soviet analyst, so I'm a Cold War guy. Unlike some of you newer people, not a Ukrainian, I'm an American, but I studied Russia since the early 1960s. I'm interested in the comment you made about brutality in Russia. Where does this brutality come from? What is the foundation of brutality in the Russian mindset? And we're talking about Russia now today after 91, but this is also true of the Soviets. All the way through World War II, as Ms. Fowler pointed out, the Russian army was exceptionally brutal in the way it treated the Nazis specifically. And here's Putin again, beating on the drum of the Ukrainians being Nazis, and brutality again is showing itself. Why is Russia so committed to brutality in the fighting of warfare? Give me some comments on that. Over to you.
Oh, and Mayhill, can I just tag on to that? I mean, why is Ukraine different?
Oh, do you really want an answer?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I will try to keep this brief because I've actually been thinking a lot about this as my work has really shifted from being a Soviet historian, like I was trained as a Soviet historian, to being much more of a historian of place, right? A place that went through a Soviet period, but I'm much more interested in this place, which is incredibly rich and complex. And to Cynthia's point, there are certain demographic and geographic and factors of experience that I think shape this region in ways that are different than other regions, right? So, for example, the fact that this place was a part of multiple empires, right? We've got the Ottoman Empire, and we've got the Romanov Empire, and we've got the Habsburg Empire, right? It makes it a sort of a particular cultural melting pot. The presence of different religions and diversity, right? Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians. It's never just two. It's always like 3 or 4 different major ethnicities. You can think of a very specific example, and I'll turn to John a little bit here to maybe flesh this out. But if we look at the Soviet experience is hard everywhere in the 1930s, but it's particularly hard in Soviet Ukraine because of the famine, right? The experience of famine so shaped Soviet Ukraine, not only in the villages, but also in the cities, right? Not only rural inhabitants, but also artistic intellectuals, right? Living in Kharkiv, that their experience is shaped by the Holodomor in ways that other places aren't shaped, right? In World War II, the fact that this place was under Nazi occupation, that means the experience of war is different, right? And so I think there are a lot of these sort of factors that make that shape the culture in this place and make it slightly separate.
Let me always invite, by the way, any of our guests for any of these questions, if they're not directed specifically to you, to always feel free to throw on your mic and jump in as well. I know, Irina McGowan, you wanted to ask a question, please.
Yeah, I did have a question. Thanks so much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Thank you for all these really both just very intellectually stimulating and extremely moving presentations. And I actually was hoping to ask John to expand a little bit on maybe one of Mayhill's points. So Mayhill, if you want to jump in as well, but this question of categories that we use and how we shape our narratives of the 20th century. And so John, in particular for you, I'm wondering if your experiences have sort of changed how you're thinking about Ukraine's 20th century, about your research topic in particular, and how, what sort of difference do you see that making? If you, how has that shaped your current project? And Mayhill, if you would be willing to expand on that maybe a little bit about what you're sort of thinking about for the future, then I would love to hear more about that. And I also, to echo Cynthia, I'm also really thinking about what you said about this question of how can we write about the Soviet army as a patron of the arts, right, and not as a perpetrator of violence. And then the following, just the sort of following logic, well, so then what does that say about the role of the arts in creating violence? If you have further thoughts you'd be willing to share briefly on that, I would really love to hear them.
Yeah, thank you, Irina, for a really difficult question to answer, and one that I'm not sure I have an answer to yet, but I'm still thinking through, all the time of, look, as somebody who studies not just one famine, but really 3 major famines in the Soviet period. Well, I mean, 2 major famines in the Soviet period, and one sort of, and there are more than 3. We conveniently forget about things like famine in Albania in 1924 and other places. But particularly studying Ukraine and the Holodomor, and I mean, everyone here, if anyone is of Ukrainian background, like there's, I don't need to tell you of how horrific of an experience it was. But what I can tell you is that I've always been sort of attuned to the horrors and the tragedies that Ukraine has lived through. It doesn't mean that that's all Ukraine is by any means. And in fact, I would make a stronger argument that there are a lot more positives and a lot more resistance and resilience that come out of Ukraine than just being victims. And I hate to reduce people to victims, but of course, they live through not one, but multiple tragedies, multiple genocides, right? This is something that the Soviet experience has been particularly, as Mayhill said, particularly brutal for Ukraine in that period. In the 1930s, but also in the 1940s, they live under multiple occupations. So it's particularly bad under the Soviet occupation. It's particularly bad under the German occupation, where people are starved again, by the way, where there are, sort of less big, but still micro famines that are taking place, still hunger that is taking place, to then live through World War II, which Russia, conveniently twists into a narrative that celebrates them as victors, but we forget how many millions of Ukrainians made up the Red Army. It's also their narrative too. So, for all the things that Russia claims victory over, well, Ukrainians helped, also win a war, and it's not just that. And if anything, too, we've learned how bad of a historian Putin is. He's not a historian, but when he tries to be, it's really awful. And we've seen this in his speeches consistently. But those of us who study, I happen to study some of the horrific things that have happened in the 20th century, and I'm particularly attuned to that. It's particularly difficult to write on those subjects in a normal period of time, whatever normal might be. But then to see some of the parallels playing out in 2022 and 2023, to watch Ukrainians have to give up their grain and other agricultural products to be sold across the world is a direct echo of 1933. And nations that bought from the Soviet Union should be thinking about this. To watch the Ukrainian language get suppressed, right, is an echo of the politics of Korenizatsiya or Ukrainizatsiya in the 1920s and 1930s. After they were able to have a flourishment of their culture and language, and then to have it taken away from them. The intelligentsia being dragged into war and being killed to fight for their country is another form of this suppression too. Ukraine is losing some of their best in this war, and Russia knows that. So to see, these are just some of the parallels. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but how it's changed me is it's just become more horrific, honestly. There's no other way to say it. To write about the traumas, and I'm a specialist in historical trauma. That's what I write about, is how Ukrainians attempt to come to terms with the 1932-33 Holodomor. That is my expertise. Mm-hmm. The way that they come to terms, transitional justice, trauma, grief, fear, dealing with these legacies. To watch this get suppressed in the 30s, I mean, part of the reason that they're never able to heal is that the Soviets don't let them. And now, we have this other moment in history with this war, where what I see happening actually, if we think sort of big about this, about the issue of time that I was talking about earlier, we see these multiple big tragedies which Ukraine has had to bear sort of get compacted together. And each one, there's not really a moment to heal, to come to terms with, because something keeps getting in the way. Mm-hmm. And that thing that keeps getting in the way is Russia. And, as I think about wrapping up this dissertation right now, how to conclude is very difficult. The things, I have chapters that if I didn't put years in them, you might wonder if I was writing about 1933 or 2022. My first chapter, for example, it's on the way that Ukrainians confront mass death in the wake of the famine, how they confront mass amounts of dead bodies. Okay, so when I see images where people are writing about these body brigades, in places like Bucha and Irpin, these have historical legacies that Ukrainians have had to deal with before. These sort of things are really striking for me, and they're really haunting. So the present is actually haunting the past here, rather than the past sort of haunting the present. Mm-hmm. And it's incredibly difficult to work through that. So I think we're all dealing with sort of how to teach that in our classes as well, how to incorporate all these things into our research, especially our feelings. So I hope that answers your question in some way.
Thanks so much, John. I think one of the ways also that we haven't discussed that much about on this in this group is the trauma and the time that it's going to take for all of this to be processed and the different consequences of violence. And so one of the things that I was just thinking about in your comment is how different people are doing the fighting, and the loss is going to be experienced very differently inside society. And so in Russia, it's a lot of poor people, conscripts, which has its own sadness to it. But in Ukraine, so many people are volunteers. I mean, they were like not professional soldiers. They were leading members of society who, went in to do their duty. And so I think that it's going to affect, this loss is going to affect all sectors of Ukraine society so long for so many years to come. But to shift gears just a tiny little bit and take a question from Alexander Christie on the chat. And again, maybe Victor, you could start with this. He asked, like, what is daily life like in other parts of Ukraine right now in terms of infrastructure, travel, banking? Is there an illusion of normalcy like we hear about people referring to when they talk about life in the major cities of Russia? I mean, I obviously not, but could you speak to some of that texture? I know you have family in Kiev right now, so.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we often talk about, how it becomes a new normal, but it's not normal in a way that it's normal in any way. It's more that, people are very interesting creatures, the way we adapt and, get used to things. But yeah, honestly, it's not really, it's anything but normal. I can't really speak for all the urban centers, but my family is currently staying in Kiev. They have been for quite a long time, and hasn't been a very easy experience. Like many of you probably heard, there's constant power outages, and it has been difficult, for people like my mom, for example, who work online. The entire day revolves often around just trying to find somewhere with access to Wi-Fi and, just trying to get your work done. So what my mom does is like she just tries to find different cafes or restaurants throughout the day where she can drop in for a few hours and just get some work done when there's no light home. And fortunately, it has been relatively better in recent days, but it's still a very, very big problem. And but yeah, still, even for those who are not experiencing constant shelling and like threat of death all the time, there have been some massive changes, at least from people that I know. Almost everybody lost, some kind of property, and almost everybody is much poorer than they were before. And it kind of relates to what I was talking in the beginning, how we have to accept in many ways that, this is a long-term affair in a way that a lot of people have suffered greatly. And, many hope that this war is going to end soon. But now people kind of have to come to terms with the fact that, like the property they've lost, like, and other things that happen, like there is no really resolution in sight for that. But I can't really talk too much about like day-to-day activities for most people because I obviously don't live there. But yeah, it's definitely not, it's not easy. And especially and if I do know what's going on in Kherson, for example, and that's a whole different story, right? That just people suffering all the time. If you just look it up every couple of days, there is news about new shellings. And just the other day, 6 people were killed at a bus station, and then about 40,000 people lost heating in their homes during winter. And 40,000 is probably pretty much how many people are left in Kherson right now. So yeah, it's very difficult, and you can help but feel bad for people who are who have no other place to go. And another thing, just to add, that kind of struck me the other day, I was reading some Ukrainian newspaper, and there was a large article just talking about how to convince your loved ones to move, and there are like different psychological tricks and like how to like gradually smooth them into the idea to like go elsewhere, and how to like convey that their life is in danger. And it's when you see something like this, it's really striking, that that's something you get on your national newspaper. But yeah, I hope that answers it to some extent.
Thanks, Victor. I mean, I so remember you visiting us in the fall right after the city was liberated, but even then we talked about how it was far from meaning the end of the violence, and we've certainly seen that come to pass in the months since.
I mean, even I was skeptical back then, but honestly, now it seems that, probably there won't be any kind of return to normalcy until the war ends, at least for Kherson.
Yeah. Mo, you've been waiting very patiently. Hold on, let me make it so you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Mo McDonald, there we go, we got you.
Hi, thanks, and sorry, this is not Mo, this is her husband, Mike. We're both Holy Cross alums, but we're traveling together, and I appreciate what you're doing. So I'm on this for the first time, and I am just as clueless as any of the undergrads that were referred to earlier today. But a year ago today, I started wearing a blue shirt and a gold tie every day, and I've been trying to educate myself about what's going on over there so I can pray for Ukraine all the time and try to, better understand how we should respond. And but in some of my, research or studies, whatever you want to call it, what I've seen is that Russia, and maybe colonialization has been covered before, but Russia has been attempting Russification of all of the ethnic, cultural, and linguistic minorities in its span of control for generations, if not, centuries. And I drew parallels in my own mind to that and some of the stuff that the Nazis were doing in promoting the Aryan race and destroying anybody else that was different that they thought was inferior. And I'm wondering if what is really happening here is not that the real evil is the protection of the sovereign borders of countries is what's at stake here, but rather a recognition that Russification and the destruction of all of the ethnic, cultural, and linguistic minorities within their span of control is the real evil and something that the world should be standing up to best they can. Certainly militarily, help Ukraine because that's terrible and we have to help them. But this should be an ongoing thing or an awareness that that's the real evil.
Would any of our guests like to comment?
I can just say a few things to that. I mean, I think, maybe thinking about what the real evil is maybe not the most productive way of thinking about it, right? Like it's a complex, history is complicated, right? War is complicated. I think for me, what is so striking is actually two things to pull out from your comment, right? One is this idea of what was called Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And you're absolutely right. There's this sort of idea of, the Russian Empire spreading and Russia today, right? Spreading empire through culture, through language, right? This idea of kind of we're all part of this one Russian speaking world, right? Which plays into this idea of there's no separate nations because it's all one Russian speaking world. But I think what's really at stake in this war today is actually freedom. Ukraine is a separate country. It's been a sovereign country for 30 years. It's extremely diverse. They elected a Russian-speaking Jewish president with an overwhelming majority of the vote in a completely free and fair election. And there are people that particularly since, as Victor was saying, 2013, 2014, have really created a civil society, have worked a lot on corruption, have basically become a democratic country, a free and democratic country. And they're fighting for the right to be free. They're fighting for the right to decide for themselves what they want for their country, right? And I think that when we think of U.S. support, that is what we're about in the U.S., right? We're about freedom. We're about being able to choose democratically. And Ukraine has chosen democratically. And I think that we as U.S. citizens should support their choice and should support their freedom. So I'd say that would be my response to your comment. But thank you for being here.
Anybody else? Cynthia, do you want to ask a question from the chat? Others want to raise their hand?
I was, it was funny. I was actually just, texting with my fiance because we were talking about the famine and his mother is Russian and he was saying that she considered herself she always considered the famine a genocide, but she was like Russian who grew up in Ukraine. And so when she talked about the famine, she wanted to see herself as a victim of the Stalinist dictatorship. At other times, she was like later in life, I mean, she was very pro-Russian in certain instances. And so I'm sorry, I got a little torn away from the chat because I was thinking about this, this kind of idea of how everybody is so prone to want to see themselves as victims of dictatorship and not as, you know, handmaidens of it or active participants in it. And that can even, you know, lead to lots of fluidity over time or switching between different forms of identity in order to feel like, I guess, more comfortable with different periods of history. So I'm not entirely sure there's a question there, but if Mehul and John have comments, that maybe that could lead to some interesting insights. But John, okay, I wasn't going to say this, but just for the sake of being provocative, I was just talking to my students about the famine yesterday, and I did point out that it was 2006 that the Ukrainian parliament declared it a genocide. And then it was just last year that one by one, first Britain and then Germany and then the European Parliament declared it a genocide. And so I in addition to many other points, I was trying to emphasize that no matter where your sympathies lie, you have to understand that politics and history are fused, and that in part the famine has become a vehicle through which Ukraine can talk about its separate identity and its differences to Russia, and that this can be true in a lot of ways, but it also is an attempt to construct a past where, you know, a constitutive member of the Soviet Union is remembering itself as, in many cases, like a victim of that very Soviet Union. And that is a little bit difficult, right, to negotiate. I mean, and it's become very, very, very important and powerful to Ukraine's contemporary identity. But I guess, and I'm saying this with utter total sympathy towards Ukraine, but I guess for the sake of argument, like, John, can you, I'm sure we think differently, and that's what this forum is about. And I'm just trying to be provocative in order to, you know, stimulate debate. But do you agree that there's like an element of, I hate to say instrumentality, but like there's an element of symbolic politics going on in different ways of remembering the 1932-33 famine?
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. It is a provocative question, and one that draws a lot of heat in our world. You know, it's frankly, I hate to say this, but I get sort of tired of the question of whether this was a genocide or not. My own feeling is that yes, it was. That's not a hidden agenda by any means on my part. But that's not my job in a classroom, is to tell students that it was. It's to teach it and to give them the evidence, and they make their own decisions. That's what we do as educators. There are people who disagree with that. I think that you have to take other considerations into your mind here of it's about the famine largely, of course, but it's about other things that we mentioned earlier, the oppression of religion, language, culture, identity, all these things that come into force at once. You know, the historian Roman Srbin has talked about a four-pronged cultural genocide approach to this in the 1930s. I work particularly on the famine element. And there have been, I mean, you're right, there are political elements to all of this. You know, and certainly in my work, I sort of hate the victim perpetrator narrative. It's too reductive in many ways. But I think what happens here, and this is something we have to be very careful about, is we keep turning back. I keep hearing these arguments of, okay, Ukraine is going through something, but they've been perpetrators in the past. Ukrainians have done bad things. Okay, it's not a secret. There's, in the comments here about what the Cossacks, if you want to go back to the 1600s, did to the Jews. Okay, do you want to talk about collaboration at certain points? It's there, it's in the history. No one's denying that. What I don't think is useful is, yes, these things happen and no one's denying it, but how does that help us understand the terror that is happening in Ukraine right now? This is where I think history actually, it just becomes sort of a talking point about the different elements that happened in the past. But to me, I haven't heard arguments about why that tells us, how this helps us understand Ukrainian suffering right now. Maybe Mayhill wants to say something to this as well, but I mean, certainly we could talk about the Holodomor and politics. There's been, there's sort of a scandal in Ukraine, for those of us who study it, about number inflation of deaths. The National Museum and others have been pushing a number of 10 million, which just does not sit with what the demographers have done in their work that says it's somewhere around 4 to 5. But what happens is we start getting caught up in these debates and we actually miss the event in some ways. And that's why, I think there are other questions to talk about. I think as a historian, actually calling things genocide is not my expertise. It's for the lawyers and for the people who work in the UN to decide these, whatever you call it, is it a crime against humanity? Is it a genocide? Is it whatever? There are lots of different designations. But it has been politicized in those ways of number inflation, which has actually sort of harmed the memory of the event in some ways, I would argue, of course. I put together a map, actually, you can see it online, about state resolutions in the US marking the Holodomor as genocide. And it's on, I think, the Holodomor Education Research website. You can find it. It's about the proclamations and resolutions. And if you read through them, they read very differently in many ways about how people are remembering that event based on the people that are pushing these into the offices of the politicians. So it's one way to sort of look at, the memory of the event in the United States. And of course, this is happening around the world. And I think Italy just recognized it, if I think that's right, a couple of days ago. So there are lots of people that previously were unwilling to hear about this until now. But I think my point stands and I'll turn it over to Mayhill here, of we have to be careful of, there's no denying what's happened in the past. And I don't think any good researcher or scholar is trying to overlook, we're not trying to make it a binary thing here of good or bad. History is very complex, and it's something that Mayhill said a long time ago about unraveling empire. And when you unravel empire, the fabric is fused together. Okay, and we have to sort of look at that in a certain way. But it also is not an excuse, in my opinion, to then sort of discredit what's happening to Ukraine right now. And I think we have to be mindful of that.
I would just follow up quickly on John's comment. I agree 100% with what he's saying, that we do see a lot of history kind of bandied about, right? A lot of sort of, well, Ukrainians did this, Ukrainians did that. And yeah, absolutely, 100%. I mean, we absolutely teach that in our classrooms. It's taught in Ukraine too. And I think one thing I would point out is that particularly since actually I started going to Ukraine, really picking up speed after Maidan and after the war started, an increasing number of, say, public history projects about the Holocaust and public history projects about weaving in that Jewish thread into the Ukrainian present, which have just really increased a new generation of historians of Jewish history in Ukraine. So Ukrainians who've learned Yiddish and they've learned Hebrew, and they are brilliant scholars of Jewish history, right? And are absolutely writing and talking about collaboration, about sexual assault, even in UPA itself. My colleague Marta Havrishko has written some brilliant pieces about sexual assault in UPA, which has been very difficult, right, for people to sort of see the dark sides of that organization, but they are, because that's what we do in democratic societies. We are able to look at the dark sides of our past, right, and come to terms with them. And I think that absolutely has been happening in Ukraine. And if you're interested, I can give you sort of some recommendations of some of these public history projects or some of these historians. But I think it's really important to realize that, yes, like everywhere, people have done horrible things in history, right? And we're certainly not denying that. But I think it's also important to realize, anti-Jewish violence happening in the 1940s, and that was the 1940s, right? And now we have a Jewish president, right? And so, and I would also just throw out this point that it's very important to realize when we talk about Ukraine, we're talking about a multi-ethnic place. We are not just talking about Ukrainians. Ukraine has never, ever been just Ukrainian. Like the whole thing about Ukraine, kind of one of its things is it's multi-ethnic, right? It's a lot of ethnicities living together. And so I don't know about John, but I'm pretty sure like most of us who study Ukraine, we study it as a multi-ethnic place, right? We don't just study the Ukrainian ethnicity. So I think that's really important too. When we're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about a multi-ethnic place.
And in fact, one of my, the chair of my department actually just sent me a video first thing this morning that one of her friends had made documenting the plight of the Greek community in Ukraine, which was so largely based in Mariupol, right? And which has been just absolutely destroyed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Christopher, why don't you jump in? Christopher,
John,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, John, you said something. Anne Applebaum suggested in her book, Red Famine, that one of the dark possible things behind the Holodomor was the recolonization of Ukraine by Russians to replace the Ukrainians with Russians. And so while they're depopulating while they're killing off the Ukrainians, they would replace the 3.8 or however many millions of people were killed with Russians, but that never really succeeded, did it? Is that something that could happen now? I mean, God forbid if Russia should be victorious in this thing, which I hopefully not, but could there be a genocide?
So yeah, thanks, Christopher. I'll answer the first part of the question, and then I think your second part of the question is also something that Gail is talking about now, of how to label what's going on, and we can open that up. But yeah, I mean, Applebaum writes about this sort of resettlement of Russians in Ukrainian territories to work on some of the collective farms. And there, if you look at some of the archival information, they go to some of the hardest hit areas to sort of, do the collective farm work. So that does happen, but it's actually it's not a huge amount of Russians that come over to do this, like not in a way that would replace any of the other like bigger Ukrainian populations or others. So it does happen, but to the scale, it's maybe, not, it's not gigantic, so to speak. But on the other hand, to your point about that happening now, I mean, I'll leave that to the Ukrainians to decide, but I don't think that anybody's coming in to replace them. I'll just say that.
Okay.
Although, Victor, didn't you tell me, I mean, again, it's not been successful, but didn't you talk about how like Russian families in Crimea were getting promises of like land in Kherson and things? Like there was this, at least attempt on the part of Russian authorities, like, and had things gone differently, like this prospect that they were going to move in a bunch of Russian families, maybe to get them like more invested in holding on to stolen territory.
Definitely. I mean, this is obviously all long gone, but yes, I do remember at some point there was a lot of promises going on, and not just promises. At some point, there is a lot of actual families moving into Kherson, and there are often families of the actual soldiers. Right, so they would just settle there, and there was like clear notion, of confidence that it was theirs. They would stay there. This is their land. So yeah, and but obviously soon, like they all left after the liberation back in October. But yes, it was a pretty big deal. Like you said, I think it was meant to kind of get people to be even more invested in this process.
Like another thing we have to be very thankful to Ukrainians for, that there was such heroic resistance so that these policies didn't have so much time to be enacted.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, we talked about this before, but yeah, of course, there was like early on there was this notion that, especially because it's Kherson, it's so close to Crimea, people are Russian speaking, there was this kind of expectation, that it would go very smooth, that people would be happy and they wanted to be part of Russia, so they would welcome all Russians. But right now it's kind of even ridiculous to talk about that. So much has happened since then. But yes, it was definitely a sentiment at some point.
Well, I know we've run a little bit late, Steve. I don't know about you, but I was just going to ask all panelists to
if we could, since Zachary has his hand up, can we let him ask one last question?
Yeah, I just noticed that my glasses
yeah.
weren't on. But then after Zachary,
that,
maybe so
Yeah,
that you guys can be prepared, like sort of a kind of a lightning round of like something you'd like us to take away.
Zachary, go ahead.
All right, so I'm gonna have a quick little story and then I'll move on to my general question. So as we've been talking about in this year, how it's changed everybody. So in my case, I feel kind of like how Victor is, because I was also from Ukraine, from Kiev, also was also like radicalized in 2013, 2014, but not as much as now. And with everything that's happened in the past year, of my grandparents being almost victims of an attack early on in the war, it's kind of helped, or not helped, it more drove me to be more, to identify myself more as a Ukrainian in as much of a modern sense of the word, shall we say. So I've kind of been trying to speak more of Ukrainian and Russian, despite the fact that both of them are my mother tongues. So I kind of have, in a way, a little bit of a conflict, because I'm also struggling whether to speak Russian or not, depending on who I'm speaking with. So my question, I guess, is once this war eventually ends, and eventually when all of Ukraine's territory is liberated, in regards to like its future security, like if it, for example, is not become part of NATO, because there may still be some hesitation there. So if that doesn't happen, and if Ukraine needs like guaranteed like security, like how far should we push our politicians, not just the US, but in Europe, to basically give Ukraine like ironclad guaranteed security to make sure that this like does not happen again, and how far we should go with it, basically.
So why don't we, in responding to Zachary, also just give everybody one last chance to comment, and why don't we go in the reverse order of how I had you speak at the beginning. So start with Mayhill, then John, and then we'll finish with Victor.
Okay, I'm putting a link in the chat. Hang on. These are 3 poems by Irina Shuvalova, whom I mentioned. They're translated by William Blacker. They're beautiful, especially the last one, History Sleeps and Dreams. I read that in my European history classes now. I highly recommend it. And so my plea to everyone on the Zoom is to follow Ukraine, to read Ukraine, to follow it, to go beyond the headlines, read about the poets writing, read about the dancers dancing, read about the theater people making theater, follow it, put it at the center of your attention, because it's that will keep American attention focused in response to the question. I think it's wonderful that Biden went to Kiev. I totally cried. But we want to continue American support, and we don't want that support to change in 2024. And we want to continue supporting Ukraine. I think it is so incredibly important, because Ukraine is standing up for freedom, and Ukraine is keeping the rest of us free by protecting us from Russia. And I think that we shouldn't forget what this war is about. And perhaps that sounds a bit emotional, but how can one not be emotional on this day with everything that has been happening? And I think that there is no security while Russia's not defeated. I think what will make the war end with security for Ukraine is to defeat Russia. I don't think it can happen through compromise. But read these poems. Thank you.
John, please.
Yeah, well, I first want to thank Zach for the question, and also I'm glad to hear that your family's not victims right now; they're safe. And that's really important. And I hope people are, if you need anything, please feel free to reach out to any of us. I just can't comprehend it. It's horrible. So I just want to leave with a simple sort of ask, and that is that everyone here knows at least something, if not a lot, about Ukraine. And I think it's really our duty to sort of keep Ukraine on people's mental maps. I read this great piece by Eugene Finkel today, talking about, how very few Americans could ever even point out Ukraine on a map in 2014. A few more, like 30% could do it in 2022. And now it's all over the headlines. And I'll share this just quick anecdote of when I returned from Poland, doing humanitarian work in the first part of this full-scale invasion. The war was in full force, and I got back to Detroit, and one of the customs agents saw my stamp in my passport from Ukraine, which, sometimes they pull you aside and ask questions. I'm not sure why, but she asked me, she said something along the lines of, man, there's like something going on over in Ukraine, right? Like, I'm not exactly sure what's happening, but there's something going on. And, it's just a reminder to me of, I just lived through all of that, and it sort of put power in me to remind people like what's going on and the seriousness of it. And the longer this goes on, the more that Ukraine faces the risk of sort of receding into the headlines, of becoming sort of a footnote in other events that will happen, because we have domestic and other international concerns. But I agree with Mehil of like this compromise. Ukraine remains highly important, not just for Eastern Europe, not just for Europe, but for the world. And they are really fighting on behalf of everyone. So we can do our part just by talking about Ukraine and keeping them sort of present and with us. And I think that's where I will finish, and just ask you hopefully to do the same. Thanks.
And we didn't get a chance actually to talk with John about the humanitarian work that you did when you left Ukraine. I'm wondering if you would be willing to share a link in the chat to that group that you did work with. And I would urge folks to consider supporting this or other humanitarian organizations that continue to work to support Ukrainians today. Victor, let's turn to you.
Yes, well, I think everything that I wanted to say has been mostly said, but if I could add anything, I would say that we should also kind of try to think critically about the position that Ukraine finds itself in, right? Because I feel like when a lot of people on the outside follow the news, it's more of a question, what's going on with the war and when will Ukraine win the war? But even there, it won't stop there, right? With the vision of Russia that Putin has constructed, and it seems that this is the vision that's going to carry on, it's incompatible with Ukraine's very existence, right? So we kind of have to be prepared that this is going to be Ukraine's existence from now on, right? Trying to coexist with this huge aggressor next door who wants to eliminate you at all times. And I think this just goes to show how much Ukraine needs everybody's support. And like everybody else here said, talking about it, talking about not just about the current war, but about the history, about the legacy, and and again, understand that this is not just Ukraine's problem, right? Like others said here, Ukraine is fighting for the entire world, right? This is not just a question of Ukraine's survival. This is a matter of global democracy and freedom. So yeah, I think we all should keep talking about it and learn more about Ukrainian history. I think it's really important.
I just want to thank our guests and also reaffirm, I think, something that came out of these very moving final comments. And, I know that the tragedy of this past year hits us all in various ways at various moments. And I remember last year being in Germany shortly after the siege of Mariupol came to an end, and I was staying with a friend of mine who led the Goethe Institute in Kiev for many years, but had recently moved back to Berlin. And she was talking about these colleagues and friends that she had who were based in Mariupol. And I just looked at her and she says, I know I've been trying to reach them, and they're not answering their phones or their emails. And we just sat with that for a minute. And I keep coming back to that, listening to these eloquent speakers and thinking about how one of the greatest tragedies of war and of dictatorship is the way that these individual tragedies, these stories of people get lost. I mean, in the scale of what's happening. I remember after 9/11, when the New York Times did this very wonderful thing of deciding to publish full obituaries for every single person who died in the attack. And that went on for at least a year. And I just flash back to my conversation with Susanna and just wondering of, like, you know, all of these lives and all of the connections and the people who cared and the people they touched, and you know, their whole entire reality is just gone. And then you just hope that there are people around who remember them. But again, I think it is so important for us to, first of all, feel the loss in these kinds of specific ways. So it's not just like an abstract geopolitical problem that we're studying, but also, again, to keep in mind that there is a need to not turn away. Even if you get tired of reading, you know, like stories about, oh God, another story about like shifting lines in war, right? Like trench warfare is a tragedy for millions of people who are directly or peripherally involved, and each of those people have stories, and it's hard for us to commemorate and document and remember each of these stories, but we have to do our best to face the tragedy and remind others of it. And with that in mind, just one more shout out for the commemoration concert at 6 p.m. that's going to be broadcast live on all of these NPR stations. I encourage you to tune in.
And yes, thank you to all our guests. Thank you, Victor, especially those last words. I think on the one hand, obviously nobody is experiencing this war the way that Ukrainians are, but on the other hand, it is something that we are all affected by. And while I often feel I don't have the right to speak, I also know that I don't have the right to not speak. And that's why Cynthia and I do this, and why we keep having these conversations. We invite you to join us next week, where we're going to have a book group of sorts, talking about Yevgeny Zamyatin's novel We. Come, even if you haven't had a chance to read it, but we hope that you will, and that you come ready to talk about and to share some of the most interesting passages and thinking about how this helps us to think about our world today. The week after, we'll have Alexander Vakru, who is from the Davis Center at Harvard University, who will talk about the impact of sanctions and the economic side of the war. The week after that, we have Rana Mitter, a specialist on China, who will talk about the impacts there. So we have a whole series of great guests yet to come over the course of the semester. And we appreciate everybody continuing to be with us. Take care, everyone. Have a great week, and we'll see you back here a week from today.
And thank you again to our guests.